collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
Coming up this week, a new survey shows that Greek and Turkish Cypriots are moving further apart.
Indeed, the physical distance is creating a new reality in Cypriot society, which is a reality of growing apart. And of course, one could have guessed that this would have been the result. But it's important to point out that this is happening.
Cyprus ranks 22nd out of 28 European countries on the digital index.
The problems are there, we recognize the problems, and we already have an action plan which was approved by the Council of Ministers last September, and we expect that for a very near future we have different results.
And the European Central Bank's Governing Council met this week in Nicosia.
And this is because the law for the foreclosures has not been put into effect.
The Centre for Sustainable Peace and Democratic Development, acronym SEED, had a public panel discussion last week. It was called Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots are Growing Apart, and the research was conducted under the direction of Alexandros Lordos. It was presented, Alexandros, before the panel discussion, but I think first maybe you could tell us what the research was, who you polled, and how you came to the conclusion that the two sides in Cyprus are getting further apart.
The research was part of an initiative that we've been working on for the last 2 years to develop what we call the Social Cohesion and Reconciliation Index, acronym SCORE, which is, let's say, a diagnostic tool that is designed to measure the state of social cohesion and reconciliation in divided societies. So we initially invited experts from around the world, especially people who had experience from conflict zones and intergroup tensions, such as from South Africa, from Northern Ireland, from Rwanda, and from other countries. We got their input as to what such an index should include, and then we put together several scales to measure the state of these dimensions, and then linked those to thinking ahead to how we can use these scales in order to make policy recommendations. So it's not just about having, I think that's the first part of the title that you mentioned, the Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots are growing apart. The second part of the title was, is it time to step out of the comfort zone? So the emphasis of the score is, how can we assess what's going wrong in a society, in a divided society, and what does that tell us about how we need to move forward from here on? So, based on the initial development of the score, we took a sample of 500 Greek Cypriots and 500 Turkish Cypriots. We polled them on the same questionnaire. And then we processed the results, and what we found specifically was that two variables that we call social distance and cultural distance, with social distance being the willingness to have neighbors or co-workers from the other community, cultural distance being the extent to which you see the other community as being culturally different from you. So, for instance, do they have a different language, religion, values, and so on? We saw that those two variables have been deteriorating over time. We measured it in 2013 and 2014, and we're seeing significant drops.
And that presumably is partly because there is this physical distance between people.
Indeed, the physical distance is creating a new reality in Cypriot society, which is a reality of growing apart. And of course, one could have guessed that this would have been the result, but it's important to point out that this is happening. And furthermore, not only did we find out that indeed this gap is widening over time, this sense of being different and of being alien to each other, but it also has implications in the mind of people for how they perceive a comprehensive settlement. Because what we then did was we tested the association, the relationship between this distance and willingness, for instance, to vote yes in a future referendum. And we found that the more distance people experience, the less likely they are to support the peace process. So this social dynamic directly translates into a political dynamic, which is then makes itself visible, for instance, in the ballot box. Whenever we, the people of Cyprus, have to choose, for instance, between a pro-solution agenda or an anti-solution agenda, this social and cultural distance is contributing to them choosing an anti-solution agenda when they vote. And furthermore, we saw that this effect is more prominent among specific groups.
Well, I wanted to ask you, when you said that you polled 500 people in each community, the most important thing, I suppose, when you do a poll is how you select who you ask the questions of. So how did you select the 500?
Well,
were they a good cross-section of society?
We're always very careful to make sure that we have a good, what we call in the polling science, a good random stratified sample, which is an appropriate mix of people from all districts, from all age groups, and from both genders, and making sure that there is no self-selection in the sample, in the sense that we randomly knock on doors and we don't kind of ask for people to come to us and contribute to the research, because once a sample is self-selected, then the reasons for the motivations for participating in the research may influence the results and so on. So all of that was done very professionally. I have to add here that we worked with very reputable field research organizations in order to do the actual field research. We usually subcontract that part because we believe in letting the professionals do that part because they do it best. So in the Turkish Cypriot community, we worked with Prolo Consulting for the data collection. And in the Greek Cypriot community, we worked with the University of Cyprus's Center for Field Studies, which is a new outfit, but which brings in a lot of experience from University of Cyprus academics who do a lot of field research. So all of that is okay. It was a good representative sample. We could also work backwards and see that the demographics and the responses on questions we know were what we expected them to be. So what we found was that there are specific groups in society that are more likely to display this cluster of behaviors, i.e. experiencing increasing distance from the other community, and this increasing distance being used as an argument against the peace process.
What did the panel discussion last week make of these results? Because you had a variety of people speaking, and I'm sure a lively discussion with members of both communities.
Well, let me get to that in a moment, because one final piece of results, and I will come to your question. The groups that we found were specifically susceptible to these dynamics were right-wingers from both communities, and also young people and women in the Greek Cypriot community.
That is a little bit of a surprise, is it not?
Well, I think the women part is a surprise because it's counterintuitive. In most countries, when there is a conflict, women tend to be at the forefront of peace processes. We saw it, for instance, in Northern Ireland, where it was women who were driving and motivating society to move forward. But what seems to be happening is because the Cyprus conflict is a frozen conflict, where the status quo is not non-violent, it seems that this is actually motivating, it tends to motivate women and makes them more likely to support the status quo rather than what might be perceived as an uncertain political experiment. It may also be a function of the fact that women are not involved in the peace process. It's been men, it's been middle-aged men who've been managing the peace process since the 1960s, almost without exception. And
with very little result.
And with very little result. And it's human and it's only natural to feel alienated and suspicious from something in which you're not involved. So this might also explain some of the disillusionment of young people and of women. Of course, with young people we have another dynamic. We've got young Greek Cypriots looking towards Europe and towards the West. That's how we taught them to think as Westerners and Europeans. And this whole bicommunal Christian-Muslim integrated nation between East and West that we're trying to create with a bizonal bicommunal federation may sound alien to them. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, because what is basically happening is that society is pulling the carpet under the feet of the negotiation process. The leaders are negotiating sometimes they don't negotiate. When they do negotiate, they're not very effective. But then they stop for a long time and then they come back to the table. We've all watched that show many times. But at the same time, there's an inexorable process of distancing of the communities that undermines the whole logic and rationale of seeking a reunited Cyprus. And we need to work on that. So going back to your question about the panel, that's what we discussed at the panel was possible policy directions in order to reverse this drift that is apparent.
Like what?
Well, we itemized it. We put forward 4 specific general policy directions which we felt are a rubric that could help us move forward. And these are to mainstream and enhance the acceptance of diversity, to reduce the social distance between the two communities, to foster inclusivity in the peace process, especially those groups that are alienated from the peace process, and to provide human security to citizens and help them to see that a comprehensive settlement would address their human security concerns. And more specifically, we provided recommendations for the negotiating process, a main recommendation being that they need to do some outreach and actually go out to communities and talk to people, especially young people and especially women. The parties need to help with the outreach instead of just going to the National Council every couple of months and spending a couple of days talking with their peers. They need to be going out and talking to society about the Cyprus problem and both to listen and to explain. It has to be a two-way street. So these are the kind of recommendations that we have for the political elite.
But how do you implement them? I mean, it's all very well to say we need to have outreach, we need to have this, we need to do that. Did you have concrete suggestions as how this could be achieved? Because let's face it, you ask the political parties to go out into outreach. They're really not interested in that. They only go out into outreach just before elections.
Yeah, well, we can take the horse to water, but we cannot make the horse drink. Yeah? We can point out what needs to happen, and we'll do our best to make sure that the message is at least heard from those who need to hear the message. Whether there is then a responsible attitude of taking this forward is beyond our control as researchers. But we will definitely try our best to explain and convince about the need for these processes. Ultimately, it boils down to the following question. Have we deep down accepted the division of Cyprus and we're just not telling people? Or are we still trying? If the answer is that we have deep down accepted division, as politicians and as a political class, then obviously all of these recommendations can be ignored safely, and things will eventually just drift into place. But if we still care, and if we want a way forward, then this is the way forward. We need to move beyond this closed process and into a more open democratic approach that will mobilize society and have all tracks of society moving in the same direction at the same time.
But the indications in SCORE is actually that scenario number 1 is almost a factor.
It's not looking good. It's not looking good at the moment. Yeah.
So obviously you had a former foreign minister, Erato Markouli, you had a lot of other people there talking about this. Did they feel that we've actually gone too far down the partition road to go back?
No, I'm not a proponent of pessimism. Generally, I'm not a proponent of emotional assessments of the Cyprus problem. I believe that when we study the situation, we should not be studying the situation in order to develop an emotional appraisal of whether we're optimistic or pessimistic, but to develop action plans. That's my own personal bias when I do this work, and that's why we haven't quit and we're still doing this work. And the people in the panel, like former Foreign Minister Markoulis and Emine Çolak from the Turkish Cypriot community, try to suggest very constructive ways to use these findings, and a lot of our conversation drifted on the topic of education. There seems to be an emerging consensus, not that there's nothing we can do and it's too late, but that maybe we need to start investing in the next generation, perhaps because our generation can no longer solve it. No one is actually saying this yet, but I remember several years ago I was at a conference in Israel to talk about different conflicts and so on. And Simon Peres kicked off the event with a speech. And he gave the whole audience, mostly directed to Israelis and Palestinians, the following piece of advice. Tell your children the truth. I remember it struck me at that time how wise that advice is, because it seems to me that we've been absorbed over the last several decades in a process of trying to solve the problem that we created for ourselves, by ourselves, ignoring the younger generation in the whole process. And in reality, we're creating a time bomb. When the next generation takes our place, they will be totally disinterested in addressing these problems and may even say, why should I even stay in this country? So we need to start developing a proper sense of patriotism, not in the ethno-nationalist sense, but in the inclusive sense, in the younger generation of Cyprus. Get them involved in discussions, get them to meet young people of the other community. What we are finding is that younger people in Cyprus tend to have more prejudices about the other community, but less anxiety regarding contact with them. This implies that they have these ideas in their head about what the other community is, but these ideas can easily get remedied with the slightest bit of contact and exposure. So if we start working on that, today's youth, today's adolescents, they will be the leaders of Cyprus in 10 or 15 or 20 years' time. And either they will be called to work to implement the comprehensive settlement, or worst case scenario, they will be called to come to comprehensive settlement if we haven't managed ourselves.
So there's a lot of information there, and I'm sure it's available online at the SEED website, which is?
I'll give you two websites actually. The SEED website is www.seedsofpeace.org, and then the SCORE website is www.scoreforpeace.org.
Easy enough. Alexandros Lordos, thanks.
Thank you very much.
This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
The European Union has just released its 2015 Digital Economy and Social Index, otherwise known as DESI. It's a system that ranks European countries based on their digital performance. Cyprus came in at 22nd out of 28. With me on the programme today is George Komodromos, who is the Acting Director of the Electronic Communications Department at the Ministry of Communications. George, when this came out, were you surprised? Because I thought Cyprus was doing rather better now on its digital programme.
Actually, I'm not surprised because we have these indexes some years ago. The new thing is just with this new tool, group of such indexes and give some weighted in order to be compared with the other countries in a group of indexes. But we had our performance for each separate index the other years. So according to our analysis in previous years, we realized that we have to do more in some areas, and already we did a lot of actions for this direction, but of course it needs some time in order to give some results. And if I may, I can mention that just December of 2014, we managed to reserve 85 million euros from EU funds for this sector, and we expect that a lot of actions will be take place up to 2020.
So what are you going to spend all that money on? Because one of the things that came out of the survey was that only 48% of Cypriots have basic levels of digital skills. Is the money going to be spent in the education sector?
I can say that 50 millions, more or less, will be spent for the new government services in order to be more digital. But of course, it's not only the services. You need networks in order these services to run, but of course you need the training for the people in order to know how to use it. So 50 million will be used for new government services. 5 million will be used in order to strengthen the ability of SMEs, and another 20 million for new type of networks, optical fiber. Further to that, there is a new decision very recently from the Council of Ministers about 9 million in order to educate the people. So we know what is the problems, and we already take actions to solve the problems, but of course it needs some time. This is our result.
It also said in the report that 100% of Cypriot households are covered by fixed broadband.
Yes.
Is that the case? Because surely up in the mountain villages they haven't all got fixed broadband. I know there was a plan afoot several years ago when I spoke to your predecessor about getting the entire island of Cyprus online with a special program that I think was going to be coordinated by a Greek company. But did that actually happen? I mean, if you go to some of the remote villages, are they online?
Yes, it's true that almost 100%, let's say 99.9% of households are already covered by basic broadband, and this because of our incumbent CETA. The network is there. This is not the problem. The problem is people to connect to this network and take a subscription, and because the network is there, but according to the figures, 32% of households are not connected.
Yeah, but DESI actually put that down to the cost of connecting. It did say very clearly that it's the most expensive entry-level broadband in the whole of the European Union.
It's true. The main problem is the cost, and of course is the skills, also the ability, the education.
But can you do anything about the cost? I mean, CETA is a semi-government organisation. If the government is spending money on trying to get people online, surely it has some influence on what the prices should be.
Yes, our minister already took the initiative and starts a consultation with the providers about this issue, but of course it's a matter of the independent authority of the regulator. We have an independent authority in Cyprus, the regulator for the electronic communication services and post, that has to follow regulation from EU, and according to this regulation, CETA cannot put less cost according to some provisions of this regulation. So it is not just to the CETA or to the government to have less cost. There is legislation on this issue as well, and it's a responsibility of this independent regulator.
Right, but a lack of competition is obviously not helping in terms of keeping prices down.
Yes, we agreed to this, but according to our size in Cyprus, we believe that we have 4 providers, the main providers, CETA, MTN, Primetel and CableNet. So for me there is enough competition in fixed networks, but also very recently last year we give a license to a third mobile operator, Primetel, further to MTN and CETA. Now Primetel will start to offer mobile services as well, and according to my knowledge, next month Primetel networks will be operated, and of course we will have 4G services also next month, and we expect through this competition the prices will be lower.
We will watch them with great interest to see if that actually turns out to be the case. What is the priority for you as the Electronic Communications Department in order to pull Cyprus up from a very poor 22nd out of 28 countries? We can surely do better.
Yes, of course we can do better, and there is a lot of things that we can do. A lot of authorities in Cyprus try to coordinate in order to do these things. For me, the problems are there. We recognize the problems. We already have an action plan which was approved by the Council of Ministers last September, and we expect that for the very near future we have different results.
Well, I have to say, it did also say in the report that we ranked 17th on digital public services, and we had a slight score improvement compared to the previous report. So that's some good news, but that is one big sector here in terms of the public being able to access government websites and do a lot of their transactions they need to do with government departments online.
Yes, it is needed to do a lot of things. What I try to say is all the departments in the government, all the authorities, even our politicians, well convinced that this is the future. I mean, even for the Ministry of Health, there is a cure 20 millions, 10 millions for ESE, and another 15 millions in order to do all the hospitals and all those things to be computerized. And this is very good for the single citizen.
And, of course, for productivity in the public sector.
Yeah, of course.
George Komodromos, Acting Director of the Electronic Communications Department at the Ministry of Communications, talking to us there about DESI, which is the European Digital Economy and Society Index.
Keep up to date with events in Cyprus and around the world with the Cyprus News Digest.
The Governing Council of the European Central Bank met in Nicosia this week, and ECB President Mario Draghi spoke to the press afterwards. He began by saying that the Council had decided to keep the key ECB interest rates unchanged, and said that the focus was now on the implementation of non-standard monetary policy measures.
Following up on our decisions of 22 January 2015, we will, on 9 March 2015, start purchasing euro-denominated public sector securities in the secondary market. We will also continue purchasing asset-backed securities and covered bonds, which we started last year. As previously stated, the combined monthly purchases of public and private securities will amount to 60 billion. They are intended to be carried out until the end of September 2016 and will, in any case, be conducted until we see a sustained adjustment in the path of inflation, which is consistent with our aim of achieving inflation rates below but close to 2% over the medium term. We have already seen a significant number of positive effects from these monetary policy decisions. Financial market conditions and the cost of external finance for the private economy have eased further, also following our previous monetary policy measures. In particular, borrowing conditions for firms and households have improved considerably. Moreover, money and credit dynamics have been firming. The substantial additional easing of our monetary policy stance supports and reinforces the emergence of more favorable developments of the euro area economy in an environment of improving business and consumer sentiment. The transmission of our measures to the real economy will strengthen, contributing to a further improvement in the outlook for economic growth and a reduction in economic slack. Thereby, our measures will contribute to a substantial return of inflation towards a level below but close to 2% over the medium term, and underpin the firm anchoring of medium to long-term inflation expectations. Let me now explain our assessment in greater detail, starting with the economic analysis. According to Eurostat's flash estimate, real GDP in euro area rose by 0.3% quarter-on-quarter in the last quarter of 2014, which was somewhat higher than previously expected. The latest economic data, and particularly survey evidence available up to February, point to some further improvements in economic activity at the beginning of this year. Looking ahead, we expect the economic recovery to broaden and strengthen gradually. The low level of the price of oil should continue to support households' real disposable income and corporate profitability. Domestic demand should also be further supported by our monetary policy measures, leading to ongoing improvements in financial conditions, as well as by the progress made in fiscal consolidation and structural reforms. Moreover, demand for euro area exports should benefit from improvements in price competitiveness and from the global recovery. However, The euro area recovery is likely to continue to be dampened by the necessary balance sheet adjustments in various sectors and the rather slow pace of implementation of structural reforms.
Several questions were asked about quantitative easing, and Central Bank Governor Christalla Yorkagi explained that Cyprus would not at the moment be able to benefit from the programme.
Countries like Cyprus, which are under a programme, to get benefit from the programme, they must have a positive review by the Troika. So, unfortunately, as you know, the fifth review of the Cyprus economy has not been concluded yet, and this is because the law for the foreclosures has not been put into effect. When there will be a positive review, we can start immediately and get the benefit of the program. According to the parameters of the program, the Cyprus economy can benefit up to 500 million euros throughout the effect of the program. We start with the 9th of March and it will go at least until September 2016. This program, it will have very beneficial impact for Cyprus, as it will suppress the interest rates downwards, and therefore the Cypriot government will be able to borrow at lower rates.
Central Bank Governor Christalla Yorkagi, and prior to that, Mario Draghi, who is the President of the European Central Bank, speaking to the press after the Governing Council's meeting in Nicosia earlier this week. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.